Hello, my name is David Jones, and as the coronation of King Charles III is coming up, I thought I would tell you about the very important role I played in the coronation of his mum, Queen Elizabeth II, some 70 years ago. I was a program seller, and here's what the program looked like. Quite an attractive program with lots of history inside and the order of the service, of course. And I shall be reading from my book, Smith of Lambeth and Other Tales. So, here we go. The Program Seller and Queen Salome. June the 2nd, 1953 was a wet and windy day in London town. It was also unseasonably cold. Not that unseasonable weather is uncommon in London. It occurs as often as what they call seasonable weather. What can be said is that June the 2nd was damp, chilly, and miserable. On any other day, the weather would not have been of much concern, but that was the day that had been chosen for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. She actually became queen 18 months earlier when her father, King George VI, died. To make it official, however, there had to be a coronation. It had to be formally declared to the world that Elizabeth was, by the grace of God of Great Britain, Ireland, and the British Dominion beyond the seas, Queen. She would also become Defender of the Faith, a title inherited from King Henry VIII, who claimed the designation for himself when he severed ties with the Pope in Rome. Severing was quite a pastime for Henry. Queen of Ireland is a bit of a stretch. That also dated back to King Henry. Maybe Queen of the northeast corner of Ireland would have served better. Coronation Day had been decided upon by a committee formed to organize the whole show. They had to settle on the date a year ahead of time and hope for the best, and hope for good weather. Weather was important, as an enormous procession through the streets of London was planned, and the crowd was expected to rise into the millions. In a bizarre move, the committee asked the weather forecasting folks to look up the historical records and to settle upon a date on which it was least likely to rain. A crystal ball would have served just as well. The records indicated that June the 2nd had the best chance of acceptable weather, and so that is what they chose. On the auspicious day, it drizzled, it rained, and it poured. So much for historical records. They must have been a bunch of crackpots to even try to forecast what the weather would be like a year ahead of time. English weather changes every 10 minutes. June the 1st was fine, and the evening was good enough for people to pick their spots on the procession route and sleep out on the pavements. The morning of June 2nd, however, brought a dramatic change for the worse. The weather folks said it was high pressure over the Atlantic and low pressure over Europe, or maybe it was the other way around, who knows. Whatever it was the cause of the terrible weather. To help with chores on the big day, selling programs, opening car doors, and so on, the organizers recruited Boy Scouts and young people from similar groups. I was by then 18 years old, and my active scouting days were long over, but I still remained involved to some extent. It sounded like an opportunity to be a part of history. Well, might be overstating it a bit, but I decided to volunteer to be a program seller. So on the evening of June the 1st, I put on my old Scout's uniform and reported to County Hall on the south side of Westminster Bridge, where I would learn about the responsibilities of being a program seller. County Hall was the headquarters of the London County Council and one of the centres of operation on Coronation Day. Volunteers were allowed to stay in County Hall on the night of June 1st. I can't recall what the sleeping arrangements were, but they had to have been a lot better than sleeping out on the pavement. At about 6 a.m. on the morning of June the 2nd, I left County Hall and walked across Westminster Bridge to the prime sales territory that had been assigned to me. It was in Parliament Square, right outside of Westminster Abbey. I had a bunch of souvenir programs in a bag slung over my shoulder, and a tin with a slot in the top for taking the money. Programs were to be sold for half a crown, that is 2 shillings and sixpence each. It had not started to rain yet, but it did not look good. The grey light of dawn was made darker by the threatening skies, but spirits were high among people who had slept out all night in order to get a good position to see the Queen and the great procession. Viewing stands had been built in Parliament Square, and those who had reserved seats had to be in those seats very early in the morning and then stay within the confines of the viewing area until the show was over. Hope they had plenty of porta potties. It must have been very uncomfortable. In the early hours of the morning, excitement began rippling through the crowd as the news came that Edmund Hillary and Tiger Tenzing Norgay had reached the summit of Mount Everest. They were the first climbers to have conquered the mountain and who have safely returned to their base camp. Edmund, a New Zealander, was quoted as saying, "We knocked the bastard off." It seemed like a good omen for Queen Elizabeth. Unlike the trapped spectators, I was free to go where I liked. I saw the first soldiers line the route around the square. They stood about 3 feet apart, each having placed his neatly folded rain gear at his feet. When the rain began, I expected someone in command to tell the soldiers to put the gear on, but no one did. I watched the soldiers' uniform turn from damp to sodden as the rain soaked into the fabric of their clothing. They had to endure the absurdity and the discomfort of their situation. They must not, above all, move. Only an officer could tell them to do that, and I can't recall seeing an officer's. There must have been somewhere nearby, maybe in the pub. I found shelter under the awnings around the abbey. Lords, dukes and earls, with finely attired ladies, all in their ceremonial gear, were huddled in similar places. It was like they were taking a tea break. Some of the lords had rolled up their trousers, as one would do to go paddling in the sea, and they were showing the fancy ceremonial socks, many of them puffing on cigarettes. Not an impressive-looking bunch at all. After the invited congregation of musicians, choirs, and dignitaries had assembled in the abbey, the real guests of honor came in. Not many Londoners knew who these guests of honor were, and neither did I. They were of little interest. The crowd was waiting for the Queen. She eventually arrived in an enormous golden horse-drawn coach, attended by costume footmen and the oddly named household cavalry. She was assisted out of the coach, and she needed all of the assistance she could get, as she was wearing her coronation outfit, which included the heavy and cumbersome robe of state. It was almost too much for her. The Queen was quoted as saying to her attendants, "Give me a push to get me started." She then had to drag the 12-foot-long robe up the carpeted aisle to where the Archbishop of Canterbury was waiting for her. She had to be reported. It has been reported that the pile of the carpet was against her, and the friction between the robe and the carpet more than doubled her task. The ceremony was covered on TV, the commentator being the well-known Richard Dimbleby. He spoke in hushed and reverent whispers as he described the rituals of the coronation in the abbey. His commentary was broadcast to the crowd in the square, and I think to everyone with a wireless in Britain. One part of the ceremony was not shown to the public. That was the mystery of the anointing, when the Archbishop touched the Queen with oils. to quote from the order of service. 4 knights of the Garter, in their velvet mantles of azure lined in white, hold over her a canopy of cloth of gold, so that she is fully seen by none but the Archbishop. The Archbishop then dips his thumb into a spoon filled with consecrated oils and touches the Queen on her hands, her breast, and the crown of her head. That must have been a heady moment for His Aged Eminence, but he seems to have held it together. The Queen at that time was a very attractive young woman, and whether the elderly cleric followed all of the instructions as written, we shall never know. It was a long and tiring ceremony, and the language was archaic. At one point, the Archbishop prays for the Queen to use the sword of state for the terror and punishment of evildoers. Not easy listening for those outside in the rain. Keeping out of the rain took precedence over listening to the Archbishop droning on, so I returned to one of the dry spots under an awning around the abbey. When the Queen had been crowned and all of the formalities were over, it was time to head back to Buckingham Palace. The abbey bells clanged and clanged, and the crowds lining the streets were ready to see the mighty procession pass by on its long and circuitous journey back to the palace. It was probably the last great procession of that kind that the world would ever see. It was said to be 3 miles long, with bands, mounted soldiers, foot soldiers, sailors and airmen from all over what was still known as the British Empire, on which the sun was about to set. There were scores of magnificent horse-drawn carriages carrying very important people, and a lot of people no one had ever heard of, like the Sultan of Selangor. Where is Selangor? There was, however, among the famous and the nobodies, a clear superstar apart from the Queen herself, someone most people had never heard of. Queen Salome of Tonga. She stole the show. She was a very, very large woman, 6'3" they said, and she weighed more than 300 pounds. She had a reputation in Tonga as a writer of dance songs and love poems, and she won the hearts of the crowd and all of London. She was greeted as the tallest queen from the smallest kingdom, and she clearly meant to enjoy her special moment in the pouring rain. She wanted to connect with the crowd, and connect she did. She refused to have the hood drawn over her open carriage and chose instead to brave the wet and windy elements. Hers was the only open carriage in the parade. She laughed and waved with great vigor and just enjoyed herself. The British people were not used to seeing royal folks being animated and appearing to be openly happy. Before Queen Salome, a royal wave was no more than a slight turning of the hand. In fact, it still is. The crowd loved and responded to the splendid and animated Queen. Her companion in the carriage, however, did not. He was a small, sad and huddled figure in a tall white hat. His Highness, the Sultan of Kelantan. Kelantan is somewhere in Malaysia, and that's all I know about it. He huddled tightly in the carriage, as though he were trying to wrap himself around himself to keep warm. He wanted to be somewhere else, out of the rain, but the poor fellow had to put up with his situation for the length of the parade route. He may have been a big shot in Kelantan, but he wasn't going to tell the Queen of Tonga what to do. After the coronation, Edmundo Ross, a leader of a South American orchestra in Britain, recorded a song written by Jack Fishman called The Queen of Tonga. It became very popular. It was not quite Cole Porter, but it was good, easy to sing-along pub-type song with a sing-along chorus. And when the people saw her on that torrential morn, she captured all before her, took everyone by storm. And here's the chorus. The Queen of Tonga came to Britain from far away. The Queen of Tonga came to Britain on Coronation Day. Now, who wouldn't want to sing along to a chorus like that? When the celebrated singer, composer, and cabaret performer Noel Coward was asked if he knew who the small man in the carriage with the Tongan Queen was, he replied, her lunch. It should be noted, however, that the very small Sultan had 3 wives and 23 children. So maybe he was a bit of a dark horse after all. Once the parade had passed, the party was over. I did not feel like going to Buckingham Palace to stand in the crowd and wait for the Queen to come out onto the balcony. So I walked back to County Hall to hand in my unsold programmes. Had I sold any programmes? I would have remembered that if I'd sold some, I would have had to have given some money. But I don't recall selling even one programme. I must have sold 2 or 3. But having finished with my programme selling duties, I left County Hall and strolled to the bus stop and waited for a bus to take me back to Peckham. I think the weather had improved a little by the evening, and the street parties were still going on when I got back to Lawson Road. Many streets all over the country have been closed to vehicular traffic to enable people to have parties, and like everyone else in the country, the people of Peckham had spent the day listening to the broadcast on the radio, or if they were lucky, huddled round a small black and white television set. They had tables and chairs set up in the street, and they partied, they ate, drank, danced, sang, and got rained on. But it didn't seem to matter. You get rained on a lot in London. And that's the story. Bye-bye.